Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, at the University of Oxford. Tonight, we are very thrilled and excited to celebrate the launch of the book of the Nobel Peace Prize Laureate, Juan Manuel Santos, The Battle Against Poverty. We welcome everyone who is joining here in the room, but also online, including Professor James Foster. We will also like to welcome our UNDP colleagues and those attending to the OPHI GW HDRO seminar. Tonight, this evening will open with the introduction of the book by the author, and then we will have a with the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, Tshering Tobgay, moderated by Sabina Alkire. Then we will have some space for Q&A from the public. This event will finish with some remarks by the Vice President of Costa Rica, Ana Elena Chacon. She will launch a new network of leaders who have reduced multidimensional poverty visibly in their countries. To focus on what it promises to be a very dynamic exchange, I kindly ask you to please turn your phones on silent. I call upon Sabina Alkire, who will introduce Professor Santos, and I give you a really warm welcome tonight.
To introduce Juan Manuel Santos, whose book, The Battle Against Poverty, Colombia, A Case of Leadership, is published by Oxford University Press. The book was written while he was visiting professor at the Department of International Development and at OPHI. The professorship appointed by the Vice-Chancellor opened with a distinguished public lecture at the Sheldonian in 2018 and continues through this term. When Professor Santos entered politics from journalism, he became Colombia's first Minister of Trade, where he opened the economy and negotiated trade in Latin America and toward Asia. He founded the Good Government Foundation, which engaged Anthony Giddens' Third Way, balancing a liberal economy with government interventions to guarantee fundamental social issues such as equality, security, and justice. He became finance minister as Colombia faced one of its worst economic crises in 70 years. Then, as Minister of Defense, escalated a military campaign within international law. In 2010, he was elected President of Colombia and re-elected in 2014. Colombians had known him as a security hawk, but for 6 years he led tough, complex peace negotiations that required chess skills and steely determination. The peace process, completed successfully in 2016, effectively ended a 52-year internal armed conflict. And for this achievement, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016. Professor Santos now works at the Compass Foundation for the empowerment of victims, the consolidation of peace, the reduction of poverty and inequality, and the defense of the environment globally. His first book, The Battle for Peace, was launched during his tenure as visiting professor. Professor Santos is a member also of the Elders, a group of world leaders addressing knotty issues of peace and human rights. And among many accolades, earlier this month, the cardinals in the Vatican awarded him the first Achille Silvestrini International Prize. So to summarize, our speaker is no stranger to complexity, to intractable problems, and to the need for sophisticated and determined efforts to solve them. But problems of poverty rarely benefit from such a spotlight of capable concern. As president, Professor Santos turned his formidable energies and skills to fighting the many disadvantages that batter poor persons' lives. He chaired a roundtable of ministries engaged in ending poverty in all its dimensions and used Colombia's regularly updated Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, to manage change at an accelerated pace. And it fell sharply during his years in office. And a great many other countries have already been inspired by this example. But now it is articulated through stories alongside institutional and management details in the book. Professor Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate in economics, urges us not to become coolly accustomed to poverty, but rather to turn with determination and address it year past year. And 10 years ago, while serving as President of Colombia, our speaker came to Oxford to launch with Professor Amartya Sen the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, whose secretariat is OPHI. And just 1 month after ending his second term as President of Colombia, Professor Santos arrived in Oxford and frequented OPHI. It was the beginning of a wonderful journey of intellectual exchange. And throughout these years, disrupted by a global pandemic, Oxford has had the privilege of learning from Professor Santos through lectures, conversations, and film screenings, among other events. And we've been enriched in this academic community and beyond. Professor Santos is an economist and a leader, and the book, as you will soon hear, bears the marks of a courageous, humane, and rigorous mind. So this event marks a climax of Professor Santos's time in Oxford and the beginning of a journey in which his leadership lessons of fighting against poverty can be widely shared. We can all learn from him and from his experience. Hence, it is my honor to call on Professor Juan Manuel Santos to launch his book, The Battle Against Poverty, Colombia, A Case of Leadership.
Good evening. Now you, okay, great. I would like, first of all, to thank Sabina for such a generous introduction. I owe Sabina a lot. And I want to distinguish the presence of my colleague here in the panel, Titi. We come back from some time, have the same values, the same objectives. His wife, Tashi. I also want to distinguish our editor, Adam Swallow, our ambassador to Colombia, our former vice president of Costa Rica, and thank you all for being here. The story of this book started 50 years ago when I was a student at the London School of Economics. I went to a class by a very distinguished young professor at that time, Amartya Sen. And I remember him starting his class by saying, there's some milk producers who stored the milk in some canteens. Somebody came and stole the canteen, and he was caught in flagranti. And you are the judges of this crime. How many of you would consider him guilty? All the class raised their hands. Then he said, I will explain a bit more. The milk producer had a very big territory and was practically the monopoly of the production of milk in the region. He used to, if there is an excess of milk, pour the milk in the river. And the person who stole the canteen was a very, very poor peasant whose son was virtually dying of hunger, and he needed milk urgently. How many of you would consider him guilty? Not one raised their hand. And he started giving a marvelous class about the ethics of the in the economy and the the way you should see uh, the whole economic theory. Many years later, when when I became president, I had studied what did my country really need and what should I do? What should be my priorities in government? And there were two which were rather obvious. One was to end a war of 50 years. We have been at war for 50 years. And the second was to try to fight with more effectiveness poverty, because we were one of the countries with the highest rate of poverty and very high inequality. So those were my two priorities. And when I was elected, they told me there is this new way of measuring poverty, inspired by Amartya Sen, and developed by two very distinguished economists. One is a marvelous lady called Sabina Alkire and James Foster. And they have been developing a way of measuring poverty and fighting poverty uh, in a different way of the traditional way of simply measuring how much you earn and how many people earn more or less than the threshold. So I was very interested and got in contact uh, with OPHI, and the process started. And we then realized the great opportunity we had, but also the great challenge, because to change things in governments, especially something so important as how you measure and fight poverty, requires a lot of coordination. And I had the privilege and the good luck of having the advice of a former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who sent to Colombia a group of people to advise me on something he called a delivery unit, which was an office that he put in place when he was Prime Minister to help him control and coordinate the priorities of his government. And I, in a way, replicated that in Colombia and started to build the institutionality to be able to confront this challenge of changing the way we were going to measure poverty, but especially how we were going to use it in order to produce results. And it was a very fascinating process of coordination that had to be led by the president, because usually in governments there is competition among ministers, and they don't like to sometimes help the other minister when this other minister is is working on the area that you have, or vice versa. So you need the president to be present there. So I started to organize my government in a way, say the number one priority is going to be uh, bringing down poverty. And we're going to use this way to measure poverty. And I supervised the process regularly. I met with the ministers, And I put a dashboard telling each minister, giving them the objectives, the targets, and measuring how they were doing and how far or how close were they of meeting those targets. And then they all got excited about the process and they all started collaborating. And we were able to put the machinery of the government in place and to push the machinery towards the objective of reducing poverty. And at the end, we were able to, and I'm very proud to say, to be the country in Latin America that during those years was reduced more poverty and inequality in Latin America. Why was this? How was this possible? And why is this tool, the MPI, so useful for any government? Because it's very practical. First of all, you go to what really is needed for a family or a person to feel that he's not poor or to have a dignified life. But there are different needs according to different regions, different areas. So that's why each country builds its own MPI. They identify their priorities. What is it that is needed here? What do we want to prioritize? And once you build your own MPI, then you have a marvelous instrument to guide you in how you channel the social resources, the social investment, and you start channeling where you're going to have the biggest effect in fighting poverty. So it's a very, very convenient tool for any government because it really gives you the information of necessary to choose with the limited budget that you have, because always budgets are limited, to choose where you're going to have the biggest impact. It could be housing, it could be health, it could be education, it depends on the different countries. And that's what we did. And it worked very well. And we started to complement this work of fighting poverty with elements that contributed to the overall objective. For example, if we wanted more equality, the most important investment, the most effective investment that you can make to promote equality is to invest in early childhood, because that's where the difference starts. A very poor family with very little income, at that time, when the boys and girls are starting to learn how to learn, if they're at a disadvantage, then when they arrive at school age, they already have a big gap, a difference. So that's why it's so important to start concentrating on where you have also the biggest impact. In early childhood, in the case of Colombia, nobody really cared about early childhood, and we did a very, very aggressive policy of investing in early childhood. A Nobel laureate, economic Nobel laureate, James Heckman, from the University of Chicago, went to launch the program. And he said, this is marvelous because this will really have an effect. And you see it today, it did have an effect. The other necessary condition to fight to be successful in fighting poverty was, of course, finishing the war. The war, as Nelson Mandela told me when he inspired me to get also in that very difficult path, the war really does not allow any country to take off. He said to me, we in South Africa would never take off if we had not finished the war, and you, Colombia, very similar conditions that like in South Africa, you will never take off if you don't finish the war. So simultaneously, I started the peace process. Very difficult also. Making peace is always difficult, much more difficult than making war. I had the opportunity to make both. I was Minister of Defense, made war, very successful war. Joaquin Villalobos helped me to make a successful war, but he helped me more to make peace. He was one of the advisors that I chose as personal advisors in the peace process. What I did was choose some advisors with hands-on experience in peace negotiations. So Joaquin, here present today, had been the chief negotiator of the Salvadoran guerrillas in the Salvadoran peace process. And I chose another one who had been the chief negotiator of the Great Britain in the Northern Ireland peace process, Jonathan Power. And I chose a good friend of mine, now who was the architect of the Camp David Agreement between Palestine and Israel, Shlomo Ben-Ami, and a professor of negotiation from Harvard, Bill Urey. The four of them gave me personal advice on what to do and what not to do. Not to the negotiators, to me personally. And that was extremely, extremely helpful. So I was fighting poverty and making peace at the same time. And they were very much interrelated. If the war produces more poverty, and poverty feeds the war. One of the what they call objective causes of war, and that's what the guerrilla said, is poverty. So that's a way of tackling the two challenges at the same time, and fortunately we were successful. So in the book, what I try to show and to explain is how we did it, the type of dilemmas that we encountered, how I organized different committees. I explained situations which were difficult to manage. Many times, when I was talking about the competition among ministries, for example, there was I remember one time, I think it's in the book, the Ministry of Housing had a huge, beautiful program. She had worked on it for about a year and a half, and we went to this committee that I had with the dashboards and the round table, and she said, "Well, this is going to help very much poverty because it's going to fulfill the needs of many people that don't have good housing." Well, somebody said, "Well, I'm sorry, but the effect on poverty of housing in the cities is not as big as if you do the same thing, but housing in the rural areas, which was controlled by the Ministry of Agriculture." And so they got into a fight, the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Housing. I said, but we have a deal here. We have a sort of a tacit agreement. We do whatever has the more effect of fighting poverty. And so the Ministry of Housing, she said, yes, Mr. President. So, and she gave her resources to the Ministry of Agriculture to build the houses, but in the rural areas where poverty was more profound. Examples of that sort are many in the book. Um, we we ended up with very good relative indicators. You never in government you can never say we did enough. That's one of the frustrations of being in government. You look back and you say I could have done more, but we did quite a bit. And the numbers, the evidence shows it that in fighting poverty by using the MPI, by being inspired and helped by Sabina, the OPHI team, which they were in constant contact with my team, and I had a very big team there. We were able to deliver, and that is one of uh, my uh, my legacies that I'm most proud of. Being able to say that my fight against poverty was relatively successful. And as I say, not completely successful because you never can say that you uh, got rid of poverty, but we were quite successful. So at the end of the government, having been able to sign the peace agreement and also showing the indicators that we had, social indicators, the poverty and the inequality, that was and is a motive of great satisfaction. And I only have words of gratitude for OPHI, um, the team is an excellent team that helped us tremendously. Now, how many countries are using the MPI? About 30 something, but there's more than 60 that are interested. So this has become uh, widespread, and the more people use it, the more people like it because of what I said. For any government, for any head of government, president or prime minister, to have those tools is a blessing because it gives you very clear the priorities where you have to invest. So uh, what I am doing now with this book is to try to convince other countries that are not using it to use it, and to try to build on what has already been done. Every process is susceptible of improving new elements. I was talking to the OPHI people, to Sabina, about we now have the challenge of climate change and how that interrelates with poverty, and how can we also measure our success with other indicators. And that's what our former Prime Minister of Bhutan is an expert in. He he's responsible for that marvelous idea of measuring instead of how much you produce is how happy you are. And right now, with what is happening in the world, that is a very good indicator to try to promote worldwide. So you're going to hear from him also, and he's also been my inspiration. Uh, an inspiration for me in this process. Measuring poverty, measuring success in government is always a matter of discussion, of analysis, but it's a great debate. And I think what we have been doing, what OPHI has been doing, is a great contribution to the world. Right now, the UN is starting to adopt it. I know many of the multilateral banks are very interested in the MPI, how they can use it. And so we're just starting. And I hope this book will be useful for students, but also for governments to simply see an example of how we did things. We, of course, made mistakes. We had very many difficulties, but at the end, I think we were successful. So thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy the book. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for those words and for the substance mixed with the stories. And that is played out in the book, and it makes it both readable at a human level and substantive at an institutional and technical level. So I'd like now to bring Tshering Tobgay into the conversation. Tshering Tobgay, or TT, you might be glad to hear, as he is affectionately known, first studied mechanical engineering in the University of Pittsburgh and later at Harvard Kennedy School, completed a master's in public administration. And after working in the civil service during the time when Bhutan was transitioning to a democracy, Tshering Tobgay dedicated himself to one of the first political parties established in Bhutan, becoming leader of the opposition from 2008, when it had its first elections. And during that period, Bhutan was the first country after Mexico to approve a multidimensional poverty measure and the first to launch an official MPI in 2010. In 2013, Tshering Tobgay was elected as Bhutan's second ever prime minister and served for 5 years until 2018. During this time, poverty remained firmly on the horizon of concern, and Bhutan used its National Multidimensional Poverty Index as a tool for targeting, budgeting, and monitoring with effect, for poverty was cut by half in nearly 5 years. Tshering Tobgay spoke twice at the UN General Assembly about this work, and photos and quotes from his address continue to circulate to this day. Tshering Tobgay is a renowned speaker, with addresses including a 2019 lecture in the Sheldonian Theatre on Bhutan's road to democracy. He seems able to shine a uniquely strategic spotlight on pivotal issues, blended with a humble and intensely human angle. For example, in 2016, he passionately discussed Bhutan's extraordinary pledge to remain carbon neutral forever, setting a world standard for environmental protection, and later delivered a critical warning about the Hindu Kush Himalayas, highlighting the impact of melting ice on more than 2 million lives downstream. During and after his tenure as prime minister, Tshering Tobgay took Bhutan's signal concept of gross national happiness a step forward by championing this GNH in the business community, and indeed launching a process to certify businesses that advance GNH in an integrated way through their products, processes, and their treatment of their staff. So again, friends, we have among us a remarkable, energetic, articulate, hardworking, and gracious leader who has energetically advanced multiple strategic priorities of interest, among them work on behalf of and in solidarity with the impoverished. So we are incredibly grateful to you and your wife Tashi for flying here from Bhutan to join us, and we look forward to our discussions. So I have two initial questions for you. First, Bhutan was able to reduce the number of people who lived in poverty very dramatically. And bearing in mind what we have heard, could you reflect a bit on Bhutan's journey under your leadership in its battle against poverty?
Thank you, Sabina. Um, Thank you for attending this event. This event is very special because we are here to celebrate my friend Juan, Professor Santos, who henceforth I should call as General Santos, because he fought for peace in a war-ravaged zone. And perhaps even more important, he sustained by peace by fighting a battle against poverty. And you are a successful general. And now he's leading a global movement to fight against poverty, a global battle using powerful tools that OPHI and Oxford have developed, Sabina, the Multidimensional Poverty Index. Because poverty is, we see it as an issue that's related with money. It's about income. But really, that's the easy part, income. But that's the very unpredictable part also. Here today, gone tomorrow. That's the nature of money. And so if you want to launch a battle against poverty, if you want to be successful, you have to fight poverty in all its manifestations. And poverty is multidimensional in nature. And this is why I'm so excited to be here. And this is why I'm so delighted to congratulate General Santos for leading a successful battle against poverty. In Bhutan, little did I know that our kings had been waging a battle against poverty. You see, Bhutan was isolated, in self-imposed isolation till the 1960s. We were a subsistence economy. Most of us were subsistent farmers. Most of us, definitely those in my age, are first generation literate. Forget about being educated. And our kings invested a lot of effort into promoting what we now know as gross national happiness. And Professor, that's not me, it's our kings. Yeah? They are the architects of gross national happiness that put overall happiness and well-being of citizens over and above just simple economic growth. Economic growth is important. Material growth is important. GDP is important. But like your people, your heroes who inspire you, Amartya Sen and Robert F. Kennedy, they say there are more important things in life we must measure. Yeah, like environment, culture, social progress, good governance. And this balance in Bhutan is what we call gross national happiness. A natural result of gross national happiness, if the principles and ideals of gross national happiness are honestly and faithfully implemented, is an automatic war against poverty. And so, Sabina, when you mentioned that in Bhutan, poverty rates have fallen down, and MPI, multidimensional poverty rates, have really cascaded over the years, from 12.7 in 2012 to 5.8 in 2017 to 2.1 in 2022. That's the MPI, which takes into consideration income, but also many other factors, including health and education. It has fallen down simply, I believe it has crashed because it has happened in one generation. And if that is the case, it's simply because our kings have given us an organic and alternate framework for development, which is gross national happiness, which balances economic growth with social progress as in free healthcare and free education, but social progress also in terms of welfare at the grassroots level. We are beneficiaries of a lot of infrastructure investment at the grassroots levels. I mean, you need roads. We talked about, Professor mentioned about poverty and homelessness, houselessness in the rural areas. You need infrastructure, you need roads, you need bridges to access your farms, and then the farmers to access markets. So the government's emphasis, the king's emphasis in these investments in health and education and infrastructure, but also very and for markets, providing markets, but also something very important in the battle against poverty in Bhutan is backstopping those who are able to escape from poverty. Yeah, in terms of debt in the family, to be able to have a life insurance, which is freely available. In terms of natural disasters, in earthquakes, to have insurance for your houses, to repair houses. If crop is damaged through natural disasters or wildlife encroachment, again, to have access to compensation. So there are many of these insurance schemes that at least allow people in the fight against poverty from sliding back into poverty. But in summary, overall, I believe that if we have succeeded in Bhutan, it is because of our kings and because of gross national happiness.
Thank you so much. And could I just ask you, what is one thing that stood out for you in terms of this book?
The title. What has stood out is the title. It's a battle against poverty. If you want to eradicate poverty, if you want to quote unquote fight poverty, you must be on a war footing. And the second is the author is General Santos, leading the war against poverty. And then there are details. If you want to fight a battle, if you want to wage war, if you want to fight poverty on a war footing, you need information. You can't just go in blindly. And that's where measurement matters. So Professor has spent a great deal of time talking about MPI, what MPI is and how it has been measured. You can't wage a war without reliable information. Even if you know intuitively there are people who are poor, who need help, who need people to fight for them, you still need information. And this is what has come out very brilliantly in the book, the importance of information. Once you get the information, it's to get the whole government involved, because poverty is not a standalone issue. No one minister can sort it, not even one president. He needs a whole team. It is an all-of-government approach. And yeah, if we must need the humility, we must have the humility to hire experts. So OPHI, to do the measurement, the government of UK helped you to develop a framework for all-of-government approach to wage battle against poverty. And then the ministers had a roundtable for poverty and inequality. So at the ministerial level, which is actually a national level, to really put the focus on the battle against poverty. But during implementation, one size does not fit all. And so the United Network, right, to eradicate extreme poverty, identifying pockets of extreme poverty and identifying customized strategies to help wage war in those special pockets of poverty. I think that's also great. So all in all, I mean, there are many lessons. But overall, I come out more inspired. Yeah, inspired because we need to understand poverty. Too few of us policymakers really take the time to think about poverty deeply enough to understand the nature of poverty and how difficult it is actually to fight poverty. And so we need case studies, we need successful cases. And in the book, I mean, Juan keeps talking about his heroes and people, his inspiration. But in doing so, he has become an inspiration. For me, definitely. But I'm sure for many other policymakers throughout the world. And in that case, General Santos is leading a movement, a global battle, a much needed global battle against poverty. So thank you, sir.
Can I make two comments? Thank you very much for promoting me, but I was in the Navy, so you can call me Admiral Santos, not General. And you mentioned something which is important, and I want to underline it. How do you motivate people that don't know or haven't been in contact with poverty? And in the book, I explain how I summoned the CEOs of the most important companies in Colombia. And we had a way to identify extreme poverty. And every household had an inventory of their needs. The kids did not go to school, or they did not have access to the health system. They were living 7, 8, 9 people per room, extreme poverty. And we made an inventory, each house. So I told the CEOs to perform that task of going to the houses of the poorest people in Colombia, and they themselves had to fill in the format. And for 98% of them, they had never seen that type of poverty. And it was such a shock that the CEOs of the most important companies, more than 50 important companies, changed completely their attitude and became engaged and enthusiastic about helping in this fight against poverty. And so it's the ideal complement of this public and private sectors working together and motivated by a specific example and experience, which is a very effective way to motivate.
Thank you both so much. We will turn it to questions, but before that, I might, if possible, ask both of you 1 or 2 questions. And the first is that both of you are leaders, not only in these topics, but also in the environment. So Colombia, under your leadership, shaped the Sustainable Development Goals, and the foundation works on environment as well as peace and poverty. And Bhutan, of course, a carbon neutral country, and has been very looked upon as an example. But so often poverty and the environment are in silos, they're separate. And so how could we bring these 2 vitally important works together a little bit more organically?
Well, there's a very clear and direct correlation between what is happening with the environment and what is happening in poverty. It's just see what is happening in the world. The floods in Pakistan, the fires in California, what climate change is doing to the production of food. By the way, we must change very fast the way we produce the food we eat, because we are destroying the soil for many, many years. The soil that used to absorb carbon dioxide, now, because we destroyed it and are using fertilizers and are using all the chemicals to produce the food, instead of absorbing, now they're emitting. And if we don't change the way we produce the food, and one way to change it is by changing the way we eat, what we eat. But anyway, that's another discussion. But the effect on poverty is direct. And that's why it's so important in any country and in the world to take into account the effect of climate change, like the pandemics. You all saw what happened with poverty with the pandemic. It went up again. Many in my region, in Latin America, what we had gained In the last 15, 20 years, we lost it in 2 years and trying to recuperate. So there is a direct correlation. And we must make that much, much more evident to be able to fight poverty and fight climate change. And I would add a third ingredient, conflict. Climate change and what's happening with the environment is also encouraging and promoting conflicts. And conflicts, as we saw in Colombia, wars produce poverty. So those are three interrelated challenges that we have to address in a comprehensive way. And this is one of the most important challenges that we have, because we need international cooperation. I went to the United Nations Security Council 2 months ago and invited by the UAE that at that time was chairing the Security Council, and they are going to be the host of COP28. And they asked me to go to the Security Council at the ministerial level and try to convince them to get involved with climate change. And I went and I made a speech which is simple common sense. Listen, Security Council, why do you exist? You exist, you were created after Second World War to promote and maintain peace. If climate change is creating conflict, you therefore have to get involved with climate change. But because of geopolitics, because right now what the United States says yes, and then Russia and China say no. And they couldn't agree on something so simple and so necessary as collaborating at the Security Council level on this issue. And we need to try to promote that type of collaboration in many aspects. Here in the University of Oxford, you've been studying the effects of artificial intelligence. We still don't know what that is going to do to us. When technology controls man and not man technology, what are the consequences? But we need to cooperate, and this is not happening. But we need to stimulate that cooperation.
We need to keep you as a general. Because the seas don't have poverty out there. The poor live on land. So we keep you as a general, right? As Professor was saying, there's a direct correlation between poverty and climate change. I'm not sure you can fight climate change and achieve net zero without fighting poverty first. Even if you can achieve net zero, and if you can reduce greenhouse gases independently, that's not going to deal with poverty. It's not going to address the issue of poverty. However, if you address the issue of poverty, it will have huge impacts to fighting climate change. Because the poor, they have to eke out a living. They are thinking about their next meal. They are thinking about the milk and the canister and the milk that's going to be spilled in because this company can't sell the milk. They are not thinking about climate change. They can't relate to it. They are thinking about their existence. They're fighting for their existence, their very survival. Under such an environment, under such conditions, you cannot ask them to protect the environment. They are going to burn whatever timber and whatever fuel is necessary to cook their limited food. And that's going to contribute to greenhouse gases. So we must win the battle against poverty so that you have the poor escape poverty. They have the means to understand technologies, better technologies that are more environmentally friendly. And beyond that, just like any one of you, any one of us, once we are not poor, we will be able to want to do our bit to fight climate change, even though it does not have anything to do with our immediate survival. We will have the luxury to think about other people in distant lands and our future children, our collective future. But the poor cannot think about our collective future and people in distant lands if they are fighting for their very survival at this moment. So the connection between poverty and environment, I think, is very powerful. And I think it can be summarized by saying zero poor for net zero. You can't have net zero if they are poor, if poverty is still existent. So you must have zero poor if you want to have net zero. Zero poor for net zero.
Wow, thank you. I should turn it open, but I'm greedy, so I'm going to ask one other quick question, which could take a long time to answer. But coming to political office takes so much time, but then when you're there, it unfolds with great speed. And so to those in the audience who are students anticipating this path, or those who have positions of leadership, could you just say any heartfelt advice you have to them about how to make a big difference on poverty quite quickly? Easy questions.
Go home and skip a meal. Put yourself in a vulnerable situation, like the challenge you gave your CEOs. Live with the poor. Drink their water. Today, water is clean in Oxford, yet we drink bottled water, yeah? We can drink from the taps. Why do we do this? Many of us will brush our teeth with this. Go to the poor and drink their water. Then you will see how unrelated you are to the existence of the poor. I think you have to be able to understand a little bit of that suffering. To see your child go to bed hungry. To know that it is this antibiotic that's going to really just automatically, almost immediately, bring the fever down, but you don't have the means to get the antibiotic. Or go and live with the poor and know that even though you're not a doctor, that all it takes is an antibiotic. But they don't know that. And as a result, they suffer. And then you put yourself in that position and your children in their children's position. That is multidimensional poverty. I think many of us must have the humility and courage to really expose ourselves. And once we expose ourselves, then we realize, I think we can realize, that many of our challenges, so-called challenges, are really nothing. Because the poor, when they say they are challenged, it's a matter of life and death. Literally, every day, day in and day out.
No, I couldn't agree more. And in any big challenge, leaders have to have what Titi mentioned, the courage to take decisions that might go against the popular will, or what I call, you must swim against the current. That's what real leadership is about. In climate change, right now you're seeing the UK, who is champion against climate change, rolling back on its commitments in the Paris Agreement. But not only the UK, you're seeing France, you're seeing Germany, you're seeing the United States rolling back at this moment when we most need on the country to double down on our commitments. Why? They are worried about the next election. They are worried about what's going to happen if I increase the price of petrol right now. You must take unpopular decisions. And if that will cost you your political capital, so be it. But think a bit more further away in order to have results. The short-sightedness right now in politics is causing us tremendous harm. And it's being multiplied because of this polarization that we are living in. Every country is polarized. Every country. And as you have learned here in Oxford, that polarization makes democracy much more difficult to produce results. So in the fight against poverty, as in the fight against climate change, as in the fight against pandemics, all these existential threats, you need bold, courageous leadership, which unfortunately we are not seeing in the world. And that is the truth, but that could be stimulated by the people, by you, by us. Don't be afraid of taking the correct decisions.
Thank you. Friends, it will be important to seek input from one other voice and mind. And this is none other than Professor Amartya Sen, who very much wished to be with us today, but is teaching classes in Harvard. And I confess that Professor Santos does not know this, but Professor Sen sent a very short, very informal 1-minute statement that he recorded between classes. And I thought we could listen to his words together.
Juan Manuel Santos' brilliant book, The Battle Against Poverty, is a wonderful contribution to the global fight against poverty, which is incomparably important. And yet, it is often neglected. I've been very fortunate in coming to know Santos and his carefully scrutinized work on advancing human progress and reducing the deprivation of people. Santos carried the fight against poverty in a dramatically successful way, both as a great political leader and as a clear-headed economic thinker whose commitment to enhancing economic advancement drew extensively on the clarity of his reasoning, as well as his concern for assessing the many dimensions of human needs. We are so very grateful to you, Santos.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabina. It's a surprise that Sabina had for me, and I am so grateful. This is really on my heart. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a message.
And pictures of both of them 10 years ago when they launched the network. So now it is time for questions and answers, and to take full advantage of our distinguished speakers, I beg questions to be crystal clear and concise. Yourself, sir? I think microphones will be coming around. We'll take 3 or 4.
Thank you very much for your very riveting remarks. It has often been argued that fighting poverty requires continued economic expansion to provide resources for this effort. However, many countries have experienced long-term stagnation, like my home Jamaica, and reduced fiscal space due to factors such as debt. What advice do you have for policymakers from these countries who are interested in fighting long-term, or rather interested in long-term poverty reduction, but suffers from limited fiscal space?
Suffer from what?
Limited fiscal space.
Oh.
In the first row? In the first row?
I'm John Huffmeyer. I'm the director of the Center on Business and Poverty. And one of the premises we make at the center is something very similar to something you stated about the importance of getting corporate leaders and corporations involved in the battle against poverty. At the same time, there are illegal businesses that are making poverty worse. So my question is, what kind of advice would you give those of us that are trying to advise governments where narcotics are an important part of an economy, and there's a context where you can, with farmers and others, create the opportunity to combat the narco businesses and bring about peace?
Thank you so much. Diego?
Professor Santos, what would you say was the most significant political challenge to actually in the fight against poverty in your government? So that's the first question. The second is, how do you secure continuity on policy in a democratic context in which governments change all the time? And,
Thank you. I think we'll stop at that.
Okay. Fighting poverty with fiscal constraints. Somebody from this country invented the response called Keynes. You can, if you spend the money correctly, it's a good business to increase your debt to fight poverty. That would be one of the solutions. Of course, the traditional response to that is also you have to start to stimulate more growth. More growth will generate more resources, and you can invest in your social policies. So there's a combination of different measures and policies that you can follow when you have fiscal constraints. But of course, it is one of the obstacles. Poor countries that don't have the resources are in a much weaker position to fight poverty. That's the truth. The narco. I have suffered many transformations in my life because of the experience that I have had. One of them has to do with the drug war. I was a hardliner. When I was Minister of Defense, I sprayed more hectares of coca cultivations than any president in the history of the world. And I signed more extraditions to the United States of drug traffickers than any president in the history of the world. 1,480 drug traffickers I extradited to the United States. And we made a big effort on fighting the cartels. But when we got the head of a cartel, he was immediately substituted. And now I am convinced that the only solution to that problem is to legalize the drug traffic, regulate it, take away from the organized crime their resources. Because, for example, in my region, in Latin America, The number one problem today, from Mexico to Argentina, is the increase and the power of organized crime. Day by day, you go to Mexico, you go to Brazil, you go to Colombia, you go to Peru, Ecuador, Argentina. They are gaining more and more control of the territory at the expense of the states. And coming from the country who has paid the highest price in the whole world in this war against drugs that was declared 70 years ago, I am now convinced that doing away with prohibition is the only way you can try to control. That's if you go back 100 years and see the discussions that took place in the United States when Al Capone controlled Chicago, when the other mafia leader controlled Los Angeles, that triggered the legalization of the liquor. Something similar we have to do today. I know it's very unpopular because it's very easy to do populism with this issue. I suffered it because I proposed that when I was president, and my political adversary said, "Look, Santos wants to poison our kids." And I went to the restaurants, and the mother said, "Are you crazy, President? Are you going to legalize it?" And I had to make meetings with the mothers and explain to them, "Listen, you are a mother, right? You have kids. If one of your kids is caught with drugs, would you rather send him that he go to jail or go to an institution to help him?" "Oh no, go to an institution." "Well, that's exactly what I'm proposing." "Oh, why don't you explain that better?" It's a very difficult, but it's the only. That's one of the examples of taking tough, unpopular decisions that are necessary. That's one of the many examples. And continuity. In my part of the world, also, we suffer from that disease, lack of continuity, because every leader thinks he's like Adam or Eve. The world starts with me, and I have to do everything new. And my predecessors, I cannot recognize any of their successes. And in that respect, we are very different from our Asian friends that think long term, and continuity is extremely important. Build on what you have already built. Don't try to make things new. Of course, if it's not working, you have to undo it. But you have many of the politicians need long term continuity. And this is something that, unfortunately, because of the political system, you get elected because the person who is in power is not doing a good job, and then you then have to change everything when you get in power, and that is a mistake.
Oh, so very quickly, continuity again, I think is very important. In every policy of every government, in every country, but since we're talking of poverty, I think we need to have the framework for continuity, and the framework is provided by the Multidimensional Poverty Index. If the MPI, through OPHI and Oxford's platform, through the United Nations, is accepted as a broad-based sort of measure for poverty, then it goes to, without saying that every government, if they are measured through the MPI, then automatically there will be continuity, because it is in the interest of every government to ensure that during their tenure, they do their best to secure as high, as good an index as possible. And this goes for all other measurements, whether it's transparency and corruption and peace or GDP, for instance. Every government, nobody challenges GDP. Every government goes full lock, stock, and barrel with GDP. And similarly, if poverty is important, I think we really need to push the MPI. 60 countries have signed up. I think 40 are practicing it. We need more. We need champions. And we need success stories. And this is what today's book is all about. For countries without resources, without, in quotation, without sufficient resources, how do you fight poverty? It's all about prioritizing. What is the purpose of government? Bhutan is a very poor country. Yeah, what is the purpose of government? And I think if policymakers think this through very carefully, very quickly you'd understand that fighting poverty in all its forms becomes a priority. Not just because it is good and we are fellow human beings and these are our fellow citizens, no. Even if we talked about poverty's connection with the environment, right? If you care about the environment, fight poverty. If you care about your economy, if you care about GDP, and poverty is sitting at 10% of the population, that's what's holding you back, perhaps, if you're not growing. It's perhaps because of poverty. Of course, you need to study. But I would say that the more you can succeed on a fight against poverty, the more you bring down the poverty rates, your economy is going to grow proportionately. I would imagine that that is the case, and perhaps we can do some studies on this. Perhaps we need some studies on this. And if we do, then we can convince our friends from many of the smaller, poorer countries, especially like Bhutan, that fighting poverty is a priority, which is good, not just for people, but good for the country at large. On drugs, I know nothing, thankfully, except that whether it's the middlemen, generally men, right? So middlemen or the farmers, you really need alternatives. If you're given a chance, an alternate, then perhaps you have you change your livelihood.
Thanks. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation, President Santos. I'm Andrei Gomez Suarez, member of OPHI, the Oxford Network for Peace Studies. I want to ask you two questions. One, you mentioned your concern with the reversal of the UK. And we've seen President Petro battle against climate change. He's been suggesting to exchange debt for climate action. Do you agree with that? The second question has to do with President Petro's battle against poverty. Do you feel that your legacy is protected by his battle against poverty?
And on the side was another question. There's so many hands and we're running out of time, so I'm not quite sure what to do, but go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you so much to both of you for coming and speaking to us today. You two are both obviously leaders in the global fight against poverty and have been commended for the real-world changes you have made in people's lives. At the end of the day, you are both fighting for the complete global eradication of poverty. Do you think this is possible without a global and structural redistribution of wealth?
Thank you so much. And then there's some in the very back. And so could you please just be brief and we'll take two. Yeah, Usha, go over there.
Hello, thank you so much again, just echoing everyone's sentiments. So my question is, would you be able to reflect a little bit more on the role that successful poverty alleviation would have on international flows of migration? Would potential immigrants have more motivation to stay in their home countries and contribute to national development? Do you think that there's a direct relationship between these phenomenons?
Thank you so much. And the last one is 2 rows behind you.
Thank you. My question is around access to digital technologies and your thoughts on whether that can be an enabler in eradication of poverty globally.
Which one?
If digital technology can be helpful in eradicating poverty. Do you want to go first?
You want to
It
try?
should be about you.
Uh,
I think yes. I think we are at the stage where we are faced with wonderful opportunities with technology, provided we use them in the right way. And I think there are many ways we can use technology to fight poverty. To begin with, measurement, to get MPIs, to measure poverty levels using digital technology.
and I would add to that question also a yes with an example. One of our complementary policies to fight poverty was to give laptops to the poorest families. And that was a tremendous success. How fast they learned to use the laptops, and the impact on their educational level increased dramatically. So yes, technology can use, but as Titi was saying, as always, depends how you use it. Even artificial technology, this is the question now. If you use it correctly, it could be very, very positive for the world, but if you use it incorrectly, it could be very negative. You asked about the President Petro. Do I think that we could make a deal of preserving the forest against that? I think yes. I think that makes a lot of sense. Preserving the forest also has to do a lot with poverty. The deforestation right now is one of the biggest problems that we have to preserve our environment. We lose, look at this statistic, 1 football field of tropical forest every 2 seconds. Every 2 seconds. A whole soccer field of tropical forest. We need to stop deforestation. And one of the reasons for deforestation in Congo or in Colombia or in Brazil, for example, you have the 2 biggest forests in the world are Congo and the Amazon. It is among other reasons, because there's other reasons. It's poverty. Poor people who go there and burn the forest to try to get some land. So that is the question is yes. Will Petro preserve the legacy of it? One of the virtues of MPI, and still it's in the beginning, but I hope that the MPI becomes something that governments cannot undo. Like a government cannot simply stop measuring inflation or unemployment. And so it's changing the poverty from a monetary indicator, how above $300 or $400, to MPI. Once that is entrenched in the system, it's. I don't think he is going to undo this. I mean, it's very difficult for him to undo it. What would be the reason? How would he explain that? So I don't think so. Migration, definitely. Poverty and migration are also related. Many of the people migrate for political reasons, but many for economic reasons, to look for a better life, and they see a better future in other countries. So definitely, migration is stimulated by poverty, and so therefore, the logical consequence is, if you fight poverty, you will stop migration, at least the migration that is caused by poverty. I think that's it.
Very good. So as we come towards a close, I'd like to invite Ana Elena Chacon, the former Vice President of Costa Rica, to the podium. Ana Elena not only has served in political office, but she's been a politician for poverty for a long time, and also worked on human rights, on feminism, on other issues, and worked on these as Congresswoman, as Minister of Security, as Ambassador of Costa Rica to Madrid, to Spain. And she now leads executive education, teaching other sitting leaders how to use poverty metrics for practical action. So over to you, Ana Elena.
Thank you, Sabina, and good night, everybody. 10 years ago, in 2013, President Santos and Amartya Sen were both here to launch the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network. Amartya Sen gave a lecture on shell domain entitled The Discovery of Woman. I love this. Chaired by Chancellor of the University, and then President Santos offered insights from Colombia and had a frank and open discussion with a minister from 16 countries from across the world. Now, MPPN has grown over to 60 countries, more than 20 international institutions, and it hosts annual high-level sites events at UN Statistic Commissions and UN General Assembly, as at the quality teleconferences where peers update one another of their programs and share the dedicated topics of interest, ranging from the using the MPI during COVID emergency to measuring child poverty to putting MPI questions into census questionnaires. 10 years on, we recognize that some of those who created the one wheels of change during their time in office, they have, like President Santos, finished the job. You know, everything good ends, but now we are in another things. Yet they remain replete with experience and sharp insights that could offer a help hand. On the 10th anniversary of the MPPN, OPHI would like to honor and equally to continue to draw upon the contributions of some pioneers who positioned MPI as a policy tool to reduce poverty in all dimensions globally by launching MPI Ambassadors Program. MPPN only converts persons who are presently in office in political offices. So today we are launching an OPHI network ambassadors and champions for those who have finished their terms in political office. This program will leverage the ambassadors' collective trajectory and ongoing commitment to reducing multidimensional poverty to raise awareness and inspires other leaders to turn a corner on poverty. Ambassadors in the network will be former senior members of government, president, prime ministers, vice presidents, or equivalent to senior leaders of multilateral organisms who use MPI and lead poverty reduction efforts and are not presently a candidate for public office or leadership in an international organization. Champions will be experts that are here, like former ministers, vice ministers, secretaries, subsecretaries, directors, representatives, and others who contribute in clear, tangible, and to the battle against poverty. Both will be invited to commit to this role for at least 2 years and will be engaged in some activities such as reaching out to peers, being interviewed, or writing for our magazine, dimension representative in office, providing strategic advice, or recording videos and podcasts, for example, of our executive educational course that both Chichi and President Santos has been spoken at. I am very pleased to launch the Ambassadors Network and to welcome President Santos as the inaugural member alongside myself. We know that Chichi will join us when the circumstances permit, and we look over for that day warmly. So, welcome, Mr. President. We are here now, ambassadors for him.
So far, I had never accepted an ambassadorship, but now I do.
Okay, I'm glad we're colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amalena.
Thank you, Sabina.
So, friends, we've had an incredible interchange of ideas and inspiration, and it certainly stirred our own memories and personal commitments, and might have inspired us to address tenacious problems that we face with the deft skills, and inspired us, I hope, to work in solidarity with and alongside the poorest in ways that will echo down into the decades. The battle against poverty will be for sale outside this hall during the reception, and you are each welcome to a simple glass after the event. Professor Santos, I cannot articulate the gratitude that I and we feel for your fierce determination to reduce poverty and your deft skill in finding new pathways to do so. Measurement is not enough, and you have certainly taken it far, far further. And we are grateful for this lyrical and substantive book, which provides encouragement, but also tractionable advice on how to mount further battles against poverty. And so our heartfelt thanks and our anticipation of future steps together. I'm deeply grateful for Tshering Tobgay's captivating example of how Bhutan has progressed, and your and Tashi's presence and insight complete the picture with voices from a very different context and yet a shared solidarity. And Annalena, we are so grateful for your visionary convening of an assembly of ambassadors and champions to share their wisdom. I thank from my heart the events team at OPHI, led by Ana Maria Marin Morales, and the entire OPHI team, past and present, as well as Rhodes House staff, for crafting this event with such cheerful aplomb. And finally, we thank you, participants in person and those online, for your own research and labor's commitments to rolling back poverty now and in the future. May they be equally successful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you.